They did not need to hear my story because they had already decided I was guilty. And the most frightening part was how certain they were. How calm, how settled, as if my life had already been categorized and filed away somewhere long before I ever woke up as Tess, stamped with a quiet verdict that required no discussion, only compliance. And in that moment I understood that this world did not punish women for what they did but for what they survived. Because survival itself was treated here as suspicious, as a disruption of an order that required women to disappear neatly when things went wrong. And they would never call it cruelty. They would never call it injustice. They would call it morality, virtue, tradition, the natural order. Words that sound harmless until you realize how efficiently they excuse harm, and everything around me looked peaceful enough to support that lie: rolling fields under pale skies, clean air, soft light. The kind of beauty people use as proof that nothing truly bad could happen here. Because real violence is supposed to be loud and visible and unmistakable, not quiet and procedural and disguised as concern. But this place specialized in a different kind of damage, one that happened politely, through lowered voices and pauses, and prayers offered on your behalf that felt less like care and more like warnings. Because here no one needed to shout to control you, they only needed you to believe that your discomfort was deserved. And from the moment I took my first breath in this borrowed body, I could feel the weight of expectations pressing in from every direction, expectations I had never agreed to, but was somehow responsible for fulfilling. Because being a woman here meant inheriting a moral debt at birth. A debt you were expected to repay with obedience, humility, gratitude, and silence, and the balance was never meant to reach zero. Because the goal was not redemption but compliance. And what unsettled me most was not the judgment itself but how seamlessly it was enforced, how no single person could be held responsible for it, because everyone participated just enough to claim innocence, passing the weight from one whisper to the next until shame became ambient, something you breathed in without noticing until it filled your lungs. And I began to see the patterns almost immediately. Patterns that became impossible to unsee once recognized. Men here made choices while women made mistakes. Men accumulated experience while women accumulated consequences. Men were allowed to be complicated while women were reduced to lessons, warnings, examples of what not to do. And whenever a woman's life went wrong, the explanation was never structural or accidental or cruelly unfair. It was always framed as a personal failure, a lapse in judgment, a moral flaw. Because blaming individuals is far easier than questioning systems, and I saw how reputations functioned as invisible cages, fragile constructs that could be cracked by rumor alone, and once damaged would never be fully repaired. Because here a woman's worth was not something she owned, but something temporarily lent to her by others and subject to withdrawal the moment it became inconvenient. And this mechanism worked so efficiently because shame did the labor of enforcement, convincing women to police themselves, to reinterpret harm as weakness, to apologize preemptively for existing incorrectly. And the tragedy everyone associated with Tess was not a twist of fate but the predictable outcome of a system that required a cautionary example to justify its own cruelty. Except I arrived with knowledge that disrupted the script, knowledge of how this story was supposed to end and how thoroughly I was expected to disappear. And knowledge changes the nature of consent. Because inevitability only works when you believe you have no alternatives. And instead of shame I felt something steadier take hold, a quiet anger that did not seek spectacle or release, but sharpened my awareness. Because anger without shame becomes clarity, and clarity is dangerous to systems built on confusion. So the first rule I broke was not dramatic or loud. It was deeply unsettling precisely because it was small. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped racing ahead of accusations to preemptively defend my existence. I stopped performing innocence for people who had already decided my guilt was inevitable. And this refusal created immediate discomfort because the system relies on women exhausting themselves trying to earn dignity. And when that labor stops, the structure begins to wobble, and people responded not with open hostility but with concern. Disappointment, pity, labeling me cold, unnatural, unfeminine. Words that sound descriptive but function as warnings. Signals to others that I was no longer safe to sympathize with. Because a woman who refuses to suffer correctly threatens the moral narrative everyone else depends on. And that was when I understood something essential about morality-driven societies. They do not care whether you are good. They care whether you are controllable. Because goodness that cannot be directed is useless to power. And once I saw that everything else made sense, the lectures disguised as guidance, the praise for resilience that always arrived after harm had already occurred, the insistence that endurance itself was a virtue, as if surviving injustice transformed it into fairness, and I realized that this story only ends tragically because everyone involved insists that it must. Because tragedy reassures the comfortable that the world is orderly, that suffering follows rules, that bad outcomes are earned rather than imposed, and I decided I would no longer participate in that reassurance. I became quiet in a different way, not submissive but observant, not broken but deliberate. And patience turned out to be a powerful position. Because people reveal far more when they assume you have already been defeated, they speak freely around you, confess their assumptions, expose the casual cruelty embedded in their certainty. And I listened without interruption, storing every inconsistency, every double standard, every moment where empathy stopped just short of inconvenience. And instead of collapsing as expected, I remained steady, and that steadiness unnerved them more than grief ever could have. Because they expected tears and received composure, expected repentance and received clarity, expected me to kneel and receive stillness. And nothing unsettles a moral judge more than a woman who refuses to perform regret on command. Because regret is the currency that sustains their authority. And without it, they are forced to confront the possibility that their judgments were never righteous at all. And let me be clear. This was never a story about forgiveness. Forgiveness is optional and too often demanded cheaply. Freedom is not optional, and I did not forgive the system that had already decided my value. I studied it, mapped it, understood its incentives and blind spots. Because once you understand the rules, you no longer need to break them loudly, you simply step out of reach. And stepping out of reach is often mistaken for weakness by those who cannot imagine resistance that does not announce itself. But distance is a form of power. Disengagement is a refusal. And refusal does not need witnesses to be effective. And they will say this is not how Tessa's story ends. They will insist that I am rewriting history, that I am unrealistic, that I am refusing to accept my place, and they are right about one thing. This is not how the story ends. This is where it stops owning me. Because somewhere between silence and defiance, I realized something irreversible. If one rule can be broken, then the rest are not laws at all. They are habits, and habits can be unlearned. And the moment I understood that, the tragedy prepared for me lost its inevitability. Because inevitability depends on participation, and I was done participating.